Good morning. The committee will come to order. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 3864, the American Energy and Infrastructure Jobs Financing Act of 2012. This legislation would reauthorize through September 30th, 2016, expenditure authority for the Highway Trust Fund and extend through September 30th, 2018, the current federal excise taxes that fund the Highway Trust Fund. H.R. 3864 also would restructure the funding sources for the highway account and mass transit account that comprise the trust fund and deposit certain non-tax revenues into the highway trust fund without increasing the deficit. We all can agree that funding improvements to the nation's infrastructure is vitally important to creating and sustaining economic growth and promoting commerce. As such, I believe this is an issue that can and should be addressed in a bipartisan manner. Cities and towns depend on a strong infrastructure as a way to ensure that they can attract businesses to locate in their communities and create jobs. In my home state of Michigan, where unemployment remains well above the national unemployment rate, having a safe and reliable transportation system can provide a strong foundation for attracting business development. However, we must approach infrastructure spending in a fiscally responsible way, and H.R. 3864 accomplishes that goal. Because infrastructure spending has consistently outpaced Highway Trust Fund revenues, we've been propping up the trust fund with deficit finance transfers from the general fund. Nevertheless, the Congressional Budget Office has recently estimated that the Highway Trust Fund will run out of money for highway projects in fiscal year 2013 and for mass transit projects in fiscal year 2014. The bill before us today will provide stable funding for these projects for at least the next 5 years without raising a dollar in new or higher taxes or adding a penny to the deficit. I think it's important to make 2 points about this bill. First, the bill has no new excise taxes. Instead, current excise taxes are extended at current levels. Second, the general fund transfers will help pay for the highway bill as they have in the past. However, unlike the past, House leaders have pledged to find the money to offset that transfer. Those items are not before us today and are being worked on by other committees. The overall highway bill has 3 principal goals: responsibly fund infrastructure improvements, create jobs, and promote domestic energy development. By transferring new revenues from the domestic energy development into the Highway Trust Fund, our bill helps to accomplish all 3 objectives without raising taxes or adding to our national debt. In fact, the Joint Committee on Taxation says that H.R. 3864 will have no net effect on federal revenues. So our task today is clear. We're here to ensure that the funds dedicated to infrastructure spending have a path to the Highway Trust Fund. And with that, I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Levin, for his statement. But before I yield to him, without objection, I ask that all members' written statements be included in the record, and Mr. Levin is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the highway bill has traditionally enjoyed support on a very bipartisan basis. Today, that isn't true. This is such a partisan bill, and I think a very inferior piece of legislation. I quote Secretary Ray LaHood, who, as you know, was a member of this House for many years and was on the Republican side, and he was quoted yesterday as saying, and I do quote, "This is the most partisan transportation bill that I have ever seen. It's the worst transportation bill I've ever seen during 35 years of public service." And then it was interesting to read what the Speaker had to say. You know, the highway bill, having bipartisan support, has done so because it invests in roads and bridges and transit, and that means jobs. You know, it means jobs that help to build our economy. But yesterday, the Speaker said this, and I quote, "We are not making the claim that spending taxpayer money on transportation projects creates jobs. We don't make that claim, and we won't make that claim." But then he went on to say this, and I quote, "Whether we like it or not, the reality is that dealing with our nation's crumbling infrastructure is part of the responsibility of governing." So what do we make of all this? I think what's happening is that the rigid ideology of Republicans on this and other issues is baffling. What's happening is that it's tying the Speaker and I think the House into knots. And that's especially unfortunate since we need to move ahead on jobs. We just received an hour ago the latest figures on jobs and unemployment. Last month, 250,000 jobs were created in the public sector, a bit more than that, and the unemployment rate dropped to 8.3. So now we're moving in the right direction, and we need to keep moving in that direction. What's happening with this bill is that it undermines the very structure of the Highway Trust Fund by eliminating guaranteed funding for transit and replacing it with monies from the general fund. And also it undermines the trust fund by using revenues unrelated to transportation and indeed outside this committee's jurisdiction. Mr. Chairman, what the Speaker said about this not being a jobs bill, but then going on to say we have to meet our responsibility, flies in the face of the fact that investing in infrastructure indeed means jobs. That's what has been the expression of the Chamber of Commerce, the expression of the National Association of Manufacturers, the expression of everybody who deals with infrastructure. So to bring up a bill, as the Speaker said, we're not making the claim that spending taxpayer money on transportation projects creates jobs. We don't make that claim, and we won't make that claim, is indeed very troubling. So I think what we need to do is to try to take this bill and take it back and to redo it in a way that once again a transportation bill becomes a bipartisan bill. So I urge that we reject this bill, that we start over, and that we start over on a bipartisan basis, as has been the tradition in this area. That's what this country needs as we're moving ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 3864, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of H.R. 3864, and I'd ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Levin. I'll be very brief. H.R. 3864 updates the expenditure purposes that are permitted to draw funds from the Highway Trust Fund to include those purposes as identified in the American Energy and Infrastructure Jobs Act of 2012. As part of the financing, the proposal extends the current law motor fuels taxes, the retail tax on heavy truck sales, the tax on certain heavy tires, and the heavy truck use tax. It extends those current law taxes at their rates generally through September 30th of 2018. In addition, the legislation would provide that certain increases in federal revenues from onshore and domestic energy leasing and production that might arise from leases authorized under other bills, in particular H.R. 3407, the Alaska Energy for American Jobs Act, H.R. 3408, the Protecting Investment in Oil Shale, the Next Generation of Environment, Energy, and Resource Security Act, and H.R. 3410, the Energy Security and Transportation Jobs Act. It would provide that the net increase in federal revenues from such activities be appropriated to the Highway Trust Fund. And then lastly, as the chairman noted in his opening statement, the legislation would modify the treatment of the mass transit account under the Highway Trust Fund. It would end the transfer of motor fuel tax amounts into the mass transit account, replacing it with a one-time appropriation of $40 billion, renaming the mass transit account the Alternative Transportation Account, and it would also provide, to the extent that receipts received from fuels taxes thus far in fiscal year 2012 have been credited to the mass transit account, that they be credited back to the Highway Trust Fund account. That concludes my brief summary of the legislation. Happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rangel. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. As relates to the transfer of funds from the trust to direct funding, to your knowledge, was there any hearings held on this by this or any other committee? Talk about the $40 billion.
I don't know about the
don't know.
other committees that oversee the highway programs. I don't believe.
What about
thus
this
far this
committee?
year we've had a hearing, Mr. Rangel.
What about this committee? You know, we've had this for decades, and municipalities and others depended on these funds. As I understand your testimony, we can no longer depend on the Highway Trust Fund or the gasoline tax, but that the Appropriations Committee, a far different committee, they will transfer $40 billion, and we don't know how they're going to do it or how it's going to pay for. Is that what we asked to vote on today, as you understand it?
Well, as I explained, there would be a one-time appropriation of $40 billion into the renamed Alternative Transportation Account. Yes, Mr. Rangel.
Well, I'm trying to frame my questions as nonpartisan as possible, but the fact is we have had a way of funding mass transit, which is a part of our economic security. So many jurisdictions depend on what we have done, and I'm just asking, as professionally as I can, are we giving up what we have as a source of funding from the Highway Committee to a promise from the Appropriations Committee that we're working on how to raise the $40 billion, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, I do believe that's a policy statement beyond Mr. Barthold's expertise.
Well,
you want to talk about the mechanism?
I'm so sorry to hear that, because Mr. Barthold has allowed us to understand so many complex problems, and I have a higher regard for his intellectual ability to understand what is happening. But if your comment means that he shouldn't go any further on this subject, I will yield to the chair, because $40 billion used to be a lot of money, Mr. Chairman. And if I understand it, and you can answer it if it's policy, why are we taking away $40 billion that we don't have, and ask it, and the budget chairman is here too, and I'll yield to him, that we don't have increased the deficit when we had a source of income that came from gasoline taxes? So I withdraw my question because it's policy, Mr. Barthold. God forbid that you should go into policy, but I yield to the chair and to the chairman of the Budget Committee.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I would just start out by saying that I agree completely with your assessment of Mr. Barthold's intellect, but I do want to point out that when the gentleman was in the majority, and at some times in the majority chaired this committee, 3 times they did general fund transfers, over $30 billion, and never once paid for that and increased the deficit in each and every time. And there was never a hearing on any of those 3 times. So
I'd like to have
I
a
know that
hearing
now
on
that the
when I
shoe
was
is on the other
chairman,
foot.
because there's some outstanding issues remaining on that question. If you want to go back to when I was chairman, I ask unanimous consent that we move swiftly to that subject.
I just wanted to remind the gentleman of the time when he was responsible for general fund transfers without hearings 3 times from 2008, 2009, 2010. So I appreciate the gentleman.
Well, I appreciate that. There's an assumption of the things that I had done as chair was correct, and you're trying to now fulfill the obligations that we had when Democrats are in control and do what we had done.
I've always had a high personal regard for the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now I'd recognize Mr. Teaberry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, we had a hearing earlier this week in the Oversight Subcommittee and the Select Revenue Subcommittee under the leadership of Dr. Bustani. The Harper maintenance tax issue and its funding were discussed. There's a bill that Dr. Bustani has introduced, a bipartisan bill that deals with helping change the problems within that trust fund. And other 2 issues that were discussed in that subcommittee hearing deal with the Short Sea Shipping Act and the American Shipping Reinvestment Act. All 3 bipartisan bills, Mr. Chairman. All 3 deal with jobs and infrastructure. We learned a lot and hope you'll work with Dr. Bustani and the other co-sponsors of the bill and I to find a proper way to get those issues resolved this Congress, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman.
I think I'll go in order. I think Mr. Stark had his hand up, so Mr. Stark's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, it's my understanding that it's the intention of the proponents of this bill to pay for the legislation by counting on money from 3 bills that have not yet passed the House nor been signed into law. Those bills would expand oil and gas exploration off the California coast, which California isn't too happy about, and as a matter of fact is opposed. Is it possible for the Joint Committee on Taxation to make an accurate revenue estimate based on bills before another committee that haven't passed yet?
Mr. Stark, we did not make any estimate based upon that pending legislation.
So you made no estimates on the revenue side of this bill?
We did. The Congressional Budget Office is generally responsible for assessing the overall outcome of the legislation and these transfers, as we noted in the table that we provided to you, are to be made by the Congressional Budget Office. So the short answer to your question is no. We did not estimate any revenues attributable to these. As sales of leases and royalty payments, that's generally in the purview of the Congressional Budget Office to begin with. I don't know if the Congressional Budget Office has had a chance to provide this information to the committee.
If I might,
please.
Mr. Stark, because it is CBO, and they have said that because this is a transfer between accounts, there's no budget effect. And I believe if Mr. Ryan might have seen that as well.
I was going to ask Mr. Ryan if...
Yeah, but the gentleman has the time.
You've got the money?
Well, it's just that he was asking about the budget effect of the transfer between accounts. I said CBO has indicated because of that there is no budget effect.
Yeah, well, but this is based on bills that haven't been passed yet. Is that correct?
Well, the transfer between accounts would be in this legislation.
The present
mechanism.
The present legislation would authorize that should there be net increases in federal revenues from subsequent legislation, that those revenues be transferred into the Highway Trust Fund account. The point that the chairman and Mr. Ryan was just making.
And if they don't pass it, we go ahead anyway.
The underlying bill hasn't been scored. The transfer won't have an effect, though.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone seek recognition? Mr. McDermott.
Mr. Berthold, I have a memo from my transit organization in Seattle, Sound Transit, that represents the district where both Mr. Reichert and I are residing and representing. They say this proposal, the transit proposal, would put at risk the remaining federal commitment for the construction of an extension of light rail from downtown Seattle to the University of Washington. In 2009, Sound Transit signed an $813 million full funding grant agreement with the FTA New Starts program. This project is under construction and scheduled to open in 2015. Now, they say that's in risk. They also say in 2008, voters in the central Puget Sound approved an $18 billion set of investments to expand the regional transit. This plan assumed $900 million in federal funding over the course of a 15-year plan, the total cost of which is $18 billion, and that's a reasonable estimate given what revenue is on the table. Can you give me assurance that if we do this, our ability to bond and finish those projects that we've already signed agreements on will not be in trouble?
Mr. McDermott, I think to give a full answer to your question requires looking at the appropriations from the fund. What this legislation does is it does authorize as trust fund, valid trust fund expenditure purposes, those purposes identified elsewhere in the American Energy and Infrastructure Jobs Financing Act of 2012. It's the Ways and Means Committee's review of the authorizing part of the legislation which is being looked at by other committees. So I can't give an assurance of what projects will be funded. But this to the extent that the overall bill permits funding of certain current projects, this the chairman's mark before you authorizes all those purposes consistent with this.
But it would seem to me that at this time in this country where we have rather unstable financial situations in lots of local governments, that when they go out to get bonds, people are going to look very, very carefully at the source of where they think the money's coming from to pay back these bonds or pay the interest on the bonds. And it seems to me moving from the dedicated fund to the whims of the appropriations process makes it inherently unstable and therefore will at least drop the bond rating from AA to B or C or something. Is that incorrect understanding of the process? I mean, I'm not a financier, okay, but I've been around government long enough to watch the bond attorneys shake their head and say no, and they're telling us it isn't going to work.
Well, Mr. McDermott, this won't be a complete answer to your question, but a couple of points to keep in mind is the committee today. The committee in general is extending the financing mechanisms for the motor fuels taxes, the heavy truck tax, tires tax, et cetera, through 2018. Remember, the expenditure purposes are only authorized through 2016, and one reason that the Congress has traditionally taken that approach is so that funding comes in over a period that's longer than the appropriations are authorized, to make sure that there are sufficient funds to try and pay for these longer-term investment programs in transportation. And the committee, as do the authorizing committees, then track this information on with projections that the Congressional Budget Office makes about the drawdown from the trust fund. If, for example, in their recent review of released just earlier this week, the Congressional Budget Office projected that there were slightly larger projected balances than they had at the mid-session review in the summer, and that was because some of the expenditure drawdown had been slower than they had previously been projecting. I hope that helps address the issue that you're raising.
It is an answer, whether it's correct or not. We'll find out. I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that the letter from Sound Transit dated 2 February 2012 from Ann Schnell McNeil be entered into the record.
Without objection. Mr. Roskam's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out, I think that the approach that's generally being discussed here is wise and forthright. You know, one of the things that we've consistently heard is a great deal of anxiety all the way around about the nature of the roads, the challenges that we have from an infrastructure point of view. And if you look ultimately, we're saying, look, the folks who are paying this gas tax, they're drivers, and that money is going to be dedicated towards that mode of transportation that they choose, that is highways and so forth. And then ultimately, not walking away from a responsibility on mass transit, what's moving forward is improving the current mass transit funding situation, where under current law, the current trend is to get $25 billion over 5 years, and instead saying, look, we're making an effort to recognize there's needs there too, and upping that to $40 billion, and that would be upfront money. So if you look at the great scheme of things, I think there's a high level of confidence that people can have, particularly the public, knowing that when they go to the pump, the tax money that they're paying
will
at
the
the
gentleman
pump
yield
is
to
going. Just let me finish one quick sentence, and then I'll be happy to yield.
Sure.
The money that they're using at the pump goes towards that dedicated purpose, and I'm happy to yield, my friend.
I know my good friend from Illinois cares deeply about transit, so I just wanted to just clarify one fact. You say the substitution of $40 billion for what would be $25 billion over the next 5 years. The chart that Mr. Bartold has given us suggests that we have contract authority for the FTA of $8.4 billion a year. So the next 5 years, that would imply that it would be over $40 billion. So I'm curious where the $25 billion that you think we're currently spending, where that number comes from. I'm confused.
I didn't follow it, so just give it to me again.
You just said.
I did. I understand what I said. I didn't understand the nature of your question.
Well, I would refer you to the chart from Mr. Bartold that points out that the transit account has current contract authority of $8.4 billion a year for the next 5 years. 8.4 times 5 is $42 billion. So I'm wondering where you get the $25 billion, because we're spending more than $25 billion over the next 5 years.
Now I understand, and I've also been informed that I'm referring to the number that's coming from the CBO table.
Of what you, so your number of CBO is what would be spent under the bill that you're considering, not what the trust fund as currently established would call for.
Right. So here's the good news. The good news is
Yes.
that the current system is going broke. You agree with me, right? It's going broke. There's no way to meet the current needs under the current system.
No. Well, with all due well, we'll get to the argument. I just wanted to clarify that
My
what you
$25
said
billion
about $25 billion.
Gentleman from Illinois
I'll
has
reclaim my
time.
time.
Okay.
My $25 billion assertion is the CBO figure.
Thank you very much.
And with that,
No.
I yield back.
I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy in curing my confusion.
All right.
Right.
Are there any further questions?
Right.
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Chairman, at this point, I would like to go on record expressing my strongest opposition to this bill. When I first came to Congress, I served on the Public Works and Transportation Committee. And never, ever did we have a partisan fight over the issue of transportation. I don't think we want to go to the bottom. This is not about our future. This is not about creating jobs. We're going backward. I think we can do better, much better. And I think we need to find a way to put all of our cards on the table, and we're not doing it this morning. And this is a very sad day for our committee.
Is the gentleman yielding back?
You're back my time.
Can I get the CBO report?
Mr. Davis is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although I understand that it's not within the committee's jurisdiction, I would like to state for the record that I'm disappointed that the overall bill does not include a funding mechanism for nationally vital major transportation projects where costs cannot be shouldered by one or two states alone. The Brent Spence Bridge in my district is an example of such an infrastructure project that's critical to our national economy, enabling more than $400 billion of commerce to travel from origin to destination annually. The bridge is functionally obsolete and needs to be replaced. However, Kentucky and Ohio would each have to dedicate their entire highway transportation infrastructure budgets, excluding all else, in order to fund the Brent Spence Bridge project. As Congress completes its work on the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, I hope a program to finance critical infrastructure projects that impact our nation as a whole will be incorporated. I'd also like to bring up another very important national infrastructure issue. Mr. Chairman, cities, towns, and utilities across the country are facing major challenges in replacing their aging and worn-out water infrastructure. At the same time, the communities in my district and around the country are also struggling to comply with federal water and wastewater regulations, leading to increased rates for customers. Deteriorating systems and costly compliance lead to disruption that harm individuals, families, and businesses. Private activity bonds are one of the best methods of providing a way to pump billions of dollars of private capital into public water infrastructure projects while shifting the economic risk away from the municipality and towards the private sector. Under current law, states receive an annual allocation of private activity bonds, but historically they've been used to fund other short-term projects rather than water infrastructure projects. In 2007, only 1.3% of private activity bonds were used to issue water and wastewater projects. I know my friend and colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, shares my concern about the significant infrastructure funding issue. In response, we introduced H.R. 1802, the Sustainable Water Infrastructure Investment Act, which would remove the volume caps for water and wastewater financing. Congress already exempts airports, intercity high-speed rail, and solid waste disposal sites from these bond caps. By leveraging private investment, this bill would result in more reliable access to clean and affordable water for American families and communities. Additionally, increased private investment in our water infrastructure will boost employment opportunities in cities and small communities across America. Mr. Chairman, would you be willing to enter into a colloquy with me on this issue?
Yes, I'd be glad to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, GAO, the EPA, and other organizations have estimated $500 billion in funding gap for our nation's aging water and wastewater infrastructure. It's our understanding that H.R. 1802 would infuse an estimated $50 billion in private capital investment over the next 10 years. Given the significant funding gap and the ability of our bill to bridge some of it, would you consider working with me and Mr. Pascrell to address this issue as the transportation bill moves forward?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Davis.
Chairman?
I appreciate the bipartisan work that you and Mr. Pascrell have put into this issue. I certainly share your position that we would do well to find ways to encourage more private investment in our water and wastewater infrastructure needs. And as we move forward, I'd be happy to work with you and Mr. Pascrell on this issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Davis controls the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your help in moving H.R. 1802 forward will be most helpful to us, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In that spirit of
Mr. Neal is
bipartisan-
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. In that spirit of bipartisanship that you've just acknowledged, Amo Houghton and I worked hard on this issue for many years here, and quite successfully. And there will be an opportunity for Mr. Davis to vote for my amendment shortly, which includes his provision. We'll have that opportunity. And when I called Amo Houghton, who was a distinguished member of this committee for many, many years, I recall ringing him up and saying, Amo, our amendment passed, to which he said, it did? My point is that at the time, people gave it very little opportunity to pass, and we succeeded in doing it and have a long DNA on the whole issue of how to use private activity bonds for, as Mr. Davis correctly said, long-term sound investment.
I would just say to the gentleman, when we started the committee, I had not yet seen the gentleman's amendment, so I look forward to looking at that amendment at some point.
We're going to give you every opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
I look forward to you sharing it with us. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to be provided with a copy of the CBO report. I haven't received it. My staff hasn't received it. I asked the Democratic staff. They don't have the CBO report. I'm told that there's an estimate that will be provided by CBO that would, I just can't find the basis for Mr. Roskam's contention that there's only $25 billion for transit over the next 5 years. So if I could have Mr. Roskam's...
Would the gentleman yield for just...
Yeah.
I believe CBO released the document on Tuesday. It's on their website, but we'll furnish you a copy.
Would you?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, and our staff hasn't. Mr. Chairman, I would like for us to understand what the actual number is here that we're talking about. Mr. Bartow, how was the $40 billion determined? Do you have that? I'm not...
The members working on the bill?
Okay. How much is in the Transit Trust Fund right now?
I don't have that information with me. That, as the chairman just noted, that was, I think, part of the Congressional Budget Office's revised estimate released on Tuesday. I don't have that before me right now.
Do you know how much the programs cost in this new definition that's going to be provided?
The new definition, that would depend upon the estimates that the Congressional Budget Office will make based upon the legislation that's being marked up in...
No, how much they currently cost?
How much... again, I would think that would be part of the Congressional Budget Office's report from Tuesday. It would report the spending over the past several fiscal years.
Could we just follow up on my friend from Seattle's earlier point about the impact on funding from the resources that heretofore have been from a trust fund that is dated back to Reagan? I mean, it was with Reagan and the Democratic Congress that the trust fund was set up in 1982, that people could borrow against those revenues that were coming under a full funding grant agreement with some degree of certitude to something that for the next 10, 15, 20 years just has $40 billion subject to annual appropriation. Does that change the equation at all in terms of the leverage and the interest rates that are going to be given?
Well, Mr. Blumenauer, just to sort of review how the trust fund, the appropriations from the trust fund and the financing of the trust funds have worked historically. As we noted earlier, and as in the chairman's mark, the funding sources have typically had an expiration date 2 years beyond the authorization for expenditures from the trust fund. And so the Congress has always, through the reauthorization process, reassessed what are the balances in the trust fund, what are the purposes to which we're putting the funds, and what are our funding sources. But they've always provided, as part of the reauthorization process, this sort of gap between 2 years' worth of funding on the tax side and the expenditure authority. And as I noted, that is in part to assure that longer-run projects that may be authorized will have adequate resources from the trust fund.
Just, Mr. Chairman, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I have requested, since you became chair, that we actually have some shirt-sleeve sessions on infrastructure financing, because this is an important part of our jurisdiction and responsibility. I think this is not a minor detail. Having, for 30 years, a trust fund that is in place until Congress repeals it, having a mechanism that has some degree of certainty that people go out in all of our states and make multi-year commitments that extend beyond the authorization date, enables them to operate with some degree of certainty. And I think as we go forward this morning, even though we haven't had hearings on it, even though the committee hasn't done the work, even though nobody on this committee knows how it's going to impact your states. I think we need to be very, very careful in terms of what this could do, potentially destabilizing major projects that all of us depend upon, and make it less likely that we'll be able to deal with the big picture in a bipartisan fashion.
Gentleman's time has expired. I would note that the CBO chart that the gentleman referred to, I understand, has been delivered to him at this time. So, Mr. Doggett is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's notable that Mr. Barthold is the only person brought before this committee on such an important piece of legislation. And his function is to advise the committee, his staff, whenever there is a revenue measure, to tell us how much money it will raise. He has told us this morning he is incapable of commenting on this bill because it is dealing with revenues outside the purview of his office, and it's being dealt with another office. As far as his testimony, it is essentially that he doesn't know how much money will be raised, if any. We can't tell from the nature of this bill whether it is basically a ticket by the Republican majority to add $40 billion more to the federal deficit or not. It is based on the possibility that some future legislation will be passed and some guesstimate by someone other than the normal revenue evaluator of how much money might be raised as a result of that. And of course, this possibility of wishing and hoping that the deficit won't be increased by $40 billion, it's that same type of uncertainty that this legislation adds for the first time in 3 decades to the transit fund. Transit being critical to many poor people getting to their job, to many students getting to their classes, whether it's at Austin Community College or Palo Alto or San Antonio College. It is about many older Americans being able to gain some mobility through public transportation systems. There is a reason why we have a highway trust fund, because there are multi-year projects and there is a need for some certainty in those projects. And it is the same reason for which we have a much smaller allocation and trust fund to provide for multi-year projects on public transportation. I understand that there is a general disdain by our Republican colleagues for programs that have titles that include the word public or social, as in Social Security or public education. But public transit is vital to the economy and to the lives of so many of our American citizens. It is also noteworthy when we talk about the bipartisan history of transportation legislation, and certainly the support for dedicated transit funds has been bipartisan going back to the Reagan years, that this legislation has demonstrated or produced significant bipartisan comment, multi-partisan comment. We hear it condemned this morning by the United States Chamber of Commerce, by the AARP, by the American Society of Civil Engineers, by the American Public Transit Association. I understand even the Republican Club for Growth has raised questions about the wisdom of this legislation. The United States Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, multiple organizations right down to Poder in Austin, Texas, citizen groups raising concerns and objections to violating the understanding, the cooperative spirit, the commitment to public transportation and dedicated funds to provide it that has existed over 3 long decades, that is being rejected this morning without any evidence to support it, and really without any witness to testify explaining why this was done. We heard so much about added transparency and public participation that would occur under this new Republican leadership. That has also been rejected with this surprise presentation of this piece of legislation. I think it is a real step backwards in so many areas. It also comes at a time after months of our asking our Republican colleagues to join with us in taking constructive steps to stimulate our economy. What better way to do that than to be building projects that taxpayers can see, like public transit systems, like needed highway projects and loops in San Marcos, Texas, to see those projects built with work that needs to be done by people who need to be working. That could be a part of this legislation, but it is rejected as an approach to get our economy moving and just takes a giant step backward. And with that, I would yield to my colleague from Oregon, who has encouraged us to...
The gentleman's time has expired, so I would just note that I just want to correct maybe what might be a misperception. This is nothing new that CBO is analyzing the trust funds. That's why we know there's a shortfall. So we've had CBO analysis of this, of these matters for many, many years. And I would just say that when the gentleman was in the majority, they did deficit spending. The general fund transfers were deficit spending, and here we are not going to deficit spend, and we're going to find revenue to make up the general fund transfer. So with that, I would yield to Mr. Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to correct one thing that my friend and colleague from Texas, Mr. Doggett, said about the Club for Growth. They didn't just express concern about this. This is a key vote alert. They're scoring this vote and asking for a no vote. Mr. Chairman, we got some real good news today. Unemployment numbers are going down. They're the lowest that they've been in 3 years. But we all know they're not going down fast enough or far enough. But we in Congress have an opportunity to do something about that. This bill, this transportation bill, or a transportation bill, long-term transportation bill, gives us an opportunity to address this issue of much-needed jobs. This is all about jobs in every one of our districts, in every district across the country. We need to fix our transportation infrastructure, and doing so will create jobs. It will remove a hidden tax that's placed on businesses because of poor infrastructure. It'll make our roadways, our overpasses, and our bridges safer, and improved transportation infrastructure will continue to create jobs long after the cement's dry. This is an opportunity for businesses from one end of our country to the other, and it's urgently needed at this time. We all know the numbers, the numbers from 30,000 feet. Every $1 billion we spend on transportation creates 30,000 new jobs. But the fact is, those 30,000 new jobs come right down to ground zero in every one of our districts. In my district, I know that in the long-term transportation bill, just 3 projects. One in Lake County, a highway improvement, will create 900 new jobs. In Napa County, an intersection improvement, 500 new jobs. In Sonoma County, a long-planned highway widening will create 9,000 new jobs. And the same holds true for all 435 districts across our great country. This particular bill is just larded up with all kinds of problems and poison pills that will prevent these new jobs from coming to fruition. Our ports and our harbors have been orphaned by this bill. We just had a hearing this week, this committee, looking at the impact in our ports and harbors and how they're being shortchanged at a time when we've got $6 billion that individual businesses have paid into the account for dredging these harbors and these waterways sitting fallow. This is money that should be addressed to the needs that are out there to get people to work, to get these harbors and these waterways cleaned up. This is a terrible bill. It's politically driven, and it just decimates our long-term local planning, and it decimates public transportation. And that's why my colleague, Mr. Doggett, pointed out that there has been a very wide breadth of communications delivered to all of us on this bill, from Democrats to Republicans to independents, from organizations, from the Chamber of Commerce, our former colleague, Republican colleague Ray LaHood, the Club for Growth, mayors and councils, all of them urging a no vote on this bill. This bill, we have an opportunity to pass a good long-term transportation bill, one that will create jobs, will help our economies, our national economy as well as our local economy. I would suggest that we send this effort back and let the Transportation Committee do what they have always done, and that's work in a bipartisan manner to create a good bill that everybody can agree on. And I yield back. I yield to Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you.
My time.
The gentleman has a few seconds left.
Okay, never mind.
All right. At this time, I ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a list of more than 50 organizations that are supporting this legislation, including the National Retail Federation, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Associated General Contractors of America, and to the gentleman's point, the International Union of Operating Engineers, as well as Laborers International Union of North America. And with that, I yield 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't object to your unanimous consent, but only ask that we get the same consideration to submit for the record all the letters that have come in opposition to the bill.
If the gentleman has any unanimous consent request, the chair will entertain it.
Thank you.
Mr. Berg is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman, I agree with the gentleman from California. This bill is about jobs. I think one thing that gets overlooked here, according to the CBO, we are increasing the dollars for mass transit. So if you put that aside, what this bill is, it's not only short-term jobs, but it's long-term jobs. Our state is frustrated by the lack of a long-term plan for construction. And that's really, I think, the overall intent here is really twofold. Put a long-term plan in place that states, whether it's a local, the state, everyone involved in the highway construction can tie into that and make long-term plans. The states on the northern tier of our country are continually frustrated by a one-year plan, a two-year plan, a short-term plan. They go through all the planning, the money's not there, and then they have to redo the planning before they can let the projects. There's a tremendous amount of time and energy that's wasted simply because from the federal level we don't have a long-term plan. What this bill truly does is it says we're going to put in adequate funding, we're going to have a revenue stream that goes forward and allow the states to do long-term planning and create short-term jobs in the construction, but really long-term jobs that encourage the commerce. I'm a strong supporter of mass transit, but if we don't have jobs for people to go through, that's the bigger concern at this point. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we're talking about the Highway Trust Fund, and so we need to keep our focus on the highway component of the trust fund, and I think that's the intent that this bill does.
All right. Mr. Kind is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I too have some serious reservations about the wisdom of the policy that is being proposed here today on a couple of levels, not least of which is this one-time transfer from the general fund, getting rid of the dedicated funding stream to the mass transit fund. And I share the sentiments of my friend and colleague from Wisconsin when he said not too long ago, and I quote, and he's the chairman of the Budget Committee, I'm concerned about the provision of this bill that would provide another general fund transfer to the Highway Trust Fund and increase the deficit. Despite claims to the contrary, the real-world impact of these transfers is an increase in the deficit. Highway Trust Fund is broken and needs to be permanently fixed. I want to find a solution that supports critical highway spending but does so responsibly without adding more debt and deficits. And that's what my friend from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, said during a similar attempt not too long ago. And I agree with that sentiment. We've got a larger problem in funding the Highway Trust Fund that needs serious consideration, and this, I don't think, is the answer. Mr. Barthel, I have a question for you. What's being proposed here today would basically bar transit programs from receiving the 20% of the federal motor fuels tax from the Highway Trust Fund. Is that right? Basically eliminates the dedicated funding stream to the mass transit fund.
The proposal eliminates the current percentage of motor fuels taxes that go to the mass transit account. That's correct, sir.
And that is to be replaced by a one-time transfer of $40 billion from the general fund?
That is correct. Although, Mr. Kind, it's also remember important to remember that all the tax revenues to the funds will expire September 30th, 2018. It's not per se.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me just raise another issue. You know, as a representative from a large rural area of western Wisconsin, and I think anyone coming from a rural state or a rural congressional district should share this concern, is that if we take away this dedicated funding stream to the Mass Transit Fund and subject this to the vagaries of an annual appropriation process, we are back into some of the biggest fights we have in this place, pitting rural areas versus urban areas. And I would submit that more times than not, we're going to lose those fights without having a dedicated, reliable, predictable funding stream going to rural America. But don't take my word for it. The National Rural Assembly's Transportation Policy Group is an entity comprised of over 450 rural organizations that are expressing serious concern about what's being proposed today. First of all, there are over 1,300 rural transit programs that will immediately come under jeopardy if we're relying upon an annual appropriation process for some type of funding that we won't be able to predict, we won't be able to rely on, they wouldn't be able to plan because of the vagaries of that funding stream, and we're going to immediately set up another rural-urban fight in this place. And unless we're content and relying upon a handful of senators from rural states to win and fight that battle, making sure that we receive our fair share to rural America, this is the new world in which we're going to find ourselves in. And these rural organizations all over the place are expressing a similar concern. They need greater predictability on where the funds are going to come from so they know the planning and can sustain these programs. You set that up on an annual appropriation fight, that goes away immediately. And to my good friend from North Dakota, if people can't get to their jobs, they're not going to work. And that's especially true in rural America, where transportation issues are always very difficult for low-income families, those struggling. You eliminate those transit programs, which this group fears will be the result of this legislation, and we're going to start seeing the unemployment rate going up again in rural America rather than back down again where we want to see it. So I think it's another additional concern that hasn't, I think, been thought out that well. You eliminate this dedicated funding stream to the transit fund, it's going to have an adverse impact in rural America, and unless we want to rely on the Senate to do our fighting for us, it's going to be hard for us to get our fair share of that funding back to our districts and to the states, rural states that we represent.
I would just say to the gentleman, this is an increase in mass transit funding. It is a lump sum transfer. There will not be annual appropriations. And to the extent that the so-called dedicated funding stream, that's subject to annual reauthorization every several years as well. So, I mean, to say that this is guaranteed under current law, it still has to be reauthorized, even the gas tax, but this is going to be a lump sum.
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time, I agree with that, and that's the problem. That's what we ought to be focused on here in this committee, is how do we have a more reliable, predictable funding stream in order to show up this fund rather than robbing Peter to pay Paul and shifting general funds. And I think the chairman of the Budget Committee is correct in his past statements. This is going to add to the deficit, ultimately, because it's just not a sustainable framework as we move forward. I yield back.
Mr. Schock's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellent point you were making, and if I can follow up on that, you know, before coming to the most important committee in Washington, D.C., I served on the second most important committee, the Transportation Infrastructure, and I'm a little surprised because I got on that committee because I was looking forward to passing a reauthorization of a highway bill. As you know, Safety Lou had expired, but when the Democratic Party controlled the House, the Senate, the White House, 60 votes in the Senate, 80-seat majority in the House, the certainty given to transit as well as highways is certainly less than 5 years. So I think it's important to review for the record and for the public who may be tuning in exactly what kind of certainty we've been providing. I mean, the certainty is only as good as long as the authorizing, is only as good as long as a bill. We are currently operating on a short-term extension, and I'm wondering if Mr. Bartold can help me with understanding or getting that information in terms of the length of time. I know the first extension was sometime in I think 2009, if I'm mistaken. Do you know, Mr. Bartold, the timelines of those extensions?
Yes, Mr. Schock. A couple of my colleagues have been checking the footnotes of the Internal Revenue Code for when we've made some extensions. Since the safety lieu legislation, there was a 15-month extension from September 30th, 2009 through December 31st of 2010.
So the first extension was 15 months of certainty.
15 months. And then the next extension from December 31st, 2010 ran through March 5th of 2011. So that was 2 months and 5 days.
2 months and 5 days, okay?
Yes, sir. And then the subsequent extension from March 5th of last year through September 30th of last year was then 5 months and 25 days.
5 months and 25 days, okay? Getting a little better.
And we are currently in an extension period that was provided for September 30th, 2011 through, let's see, March 31st of 2012. So 6 months.
6 months. So 15 months, then 2 months and 5 days, then 5 months and 25 days, and then 6 months?
Yes, those are the last.
Okay.
Those are the last 4 short-term extensions.
Okay.
Sir.
Thank you very much for that information, Mr. Bartold. So basically, over 3 years, we've had 4 extensions. I guess I'm struggling to understand why my friends on the other side of the aisle and some folks in the outside world are having such a problem with 5 years of certainty, 5 years of guaranteed funding for not only highways, but 5 years of guaranteed funding for transit, in addition to not only an extension, a 5-year extension, which is much better than 2 months or 3 months or 15 months, but actually an increase. We're not only giving them 5 years of certainty, but also an increase from $25 billion to $40 billion. Look, I think the perfect is the enemy of the good. We can sit around here and pontificate about how we would like bigger and better, more certainty, more paid for. I'm with my colleagues, but having served on the Transportation Committee for 2 years and being offered nothing but simple extensions of the status quo at much shorter time frames, I would submit to my colleagues in the community at large that this is a much better bill for a longer period of time, providing more certainty and more guarantee for both highways and transit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Jenkins is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 3B2 here in the bill changes the tax year for the use tax from a June year-end to a September year-end. And it's my understanding that these changes could be problematic for many of our trucking companies. And as I understand it, they will have a couple reoccurring issues, a cash flow problem with now the registration fees and the taxes being due near the same time, but probably more concerning is a reoccurring issue with proof of payment when they go to register their vehicles if the timing is not worked out better. So I raise these concerns just in hope that the chair might be willing to work on these issues before we bring the bill to the floor.
If you would yield. I very much appreciate you bringing this issue to my attention, and it is something that I have also been hearing about, and I pledge to work with you to correct that particular issue and try to align that date to better serve the industry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to submit for the record a series of letters. I understand they have to be submitted one at a time. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then first is from ASHO. We would like to submit that for the record.
Can the gentleman say who
the American Association for State Highway and Transportation.
Without objection.
As opposed. I would also like to submit for unanimous consent the American Public Transportation Association, who is opposed.
Without objection.
Would also like to submit the American Society of Civil Engineers, who are opposed.
Without objection.
Would like to submit the Conference of Mayors, who are opposed.
Without
And
objection.
I would like to submit, oh, is there objection?
I said without objection.
And I'd like to submit the Chamber of Commerce and its more than 600 affiliates who are opposed.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just briefly, I had the opportunity to travel to China this year and witness extraordinary infrastructure improvement all along there. Drove from Beijing to Outer Mongolia, and in the process saw what they did, putting 26 tunnels through mountains and creating an infrastructure system that employed their people. They've taken more than 300 million people out of poverty. That's who we're up against when it comes to infrastructure, and that's why the concern emanates from this committee like it does, and that's why we need to make the kind of investment. And with that, I'll turn to my colleague and yield to Earl Blumenauer along those lines.
Thank you. I want to just follow up on my good friend from Illinois' concerns about how this is great for transit, it's good for transportation, puts in certainty. The simple fact is that it doesn't. We have no idea what's going to happen with the $40 billion additional transfer to the general fund, if it's going to materialize, where it's going to come from. That's why the American Public Transit Association, and one other letter that I want to put in the record that went to Mr. Levin and Mr. Camp, signed by over 600 people in virtually every state in the union, representing transit districts, local governments, and advocacy groups, are opposed to it. Second, the fact that it's ephemeral, the $40 billion, there's no guarantee that it's going to happen. If it does, we're putting in non-general fund, putting in general fund and other resources. We're breaking this concept of the trust fund that concerns people on the right and people on the left in terms of having certainty. Second, what you haven't talked about here is how you're squunching in more than just transit. With all due respect, Mr. Roscom is wrong. I've got the CBO sheet. It doesn't suggest that there's only $25 billion. Under current programs, all of them are going to take a haircut. You attempt to do that by assuming that maybe we get $40 billion one time only. You raid the trust fund and use that to prop it up, and then you stuff more programs in it, including the most popular transportation programs, the transportation enhancement programs, and they'll be competing for a smaller, uncertain pool. That's not certainty. That is a very real problem. That's why you've been able to unite business, labor, environment, local government, transit, business associations, saying this is a goofy policy. There was a reason that Ronald Reagan and the Democratic Congress developed the Highway Trust Fund 30 years ago. It did provide certainty and focus and direction. And what we should be doing cooperatively is actually having the question about how we put money into transportation rather than raiding the general fund, using duct tape, fantasy accounting, and kicking the can down the road. This legislation, I want us to focus on our responsibilities and what it'll do to our states and the programs that are relying on us to be able to follow through. And this legislation doesn't do it. I'm going to offer an amendment in a little while that will at least get rid of this troubling Section 5. And I hope we as a committee spend time to deal with a long-term problem, which is the trust fund is running down. It's going to accelerate even more rapidly with inflation and with more fuel-efficient vehicles. And people on this committee are going to have a real problem, but it's going to be worse for the people who are depending on it. And the longer we duck it, the worse it's going to be. Thank you, and I yield back.
I would just say to the gentleman that the concern really is that if nothing's done, the Highway Trust Fund runs out of money in 2013, and the Mass Transit Trust Fund runs out of money in 2014. And as the gentleman, this is in the CBO chart that the gentleman apparently has recently just seen, even though it's been public since Tuesday. I just want to say that the multiple short-term extensions, the multiple transfers from the deficit transfers from the general fund, and what we're doing is, yes, we're transferring from the general fund as the now minority did, but we are paying for it.
Well, can I reclaim a second of the time that I recklessly?
Yes, I borrowed some of your time.
Recklessly yielded back, because the trust fund doesn't go bankrupt and go away. It continues to collect money, even if we don't do this. The balances are expired, but the money that would otherwise be available for transit and these other transportation enhancement programs would continue and be greater. But under this proposal, you gut it, you take it away, they're in Never Never Land.
All right.
Thank you.
Mr. Reed is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to open my comments with stating that sometimes leading is difficult. And what I see here is when I hear folks on both the right and left are upset, and we're getting criticism from the right and the left, that maybe we're onto something. And what I'd like to say is, as a former mayor, I can tell you one of the most frustrating things I had was when we put our capital plans together for our city, was looking to the federal government and seeing constant short-term signals as to how we were going to invest in our infrastructure. I wholeheartedly believe that a 5-year plan will bring that certainty to local municipalities so that they can have the confidence in putting their capital plans together. There is no such thing in the short term I've been here. There's no such thing as a perfect bill. And what I would be interested in doing is setting a bipartisan tone and going forward with conversations. There's some unique issues in the underlying bill and this bill that I would like to talk with my colleagues on when it comes to the bank qualified bonds and the private activity bonds section, to explore those in a bipartisan way. I know I'm working with Mr. Neal on one of those issues, and I hear Mr. Davis and Mr. Pasquale talk about potentially one of the other issues. So I would like to set a tone of openness, but let us try to lay the table for that certainty so that local officials back in their communities know that at least for 5 years, they know what the role of the federal government in those capital plans will be, because that is so critical. As a former mayor, you don't know how critical, I think, if you haven't sat in that position, how important that is to those plans. And with that, I yield back.
All right. I believe there's no further requests for questions. I'm prepared to move into amendments.
Mr. Chairman, could I just ask a question?
Yes.
Is it possible, has it ever been done in the history of this committee, where we just withdraw a bill and say, let's start over, just start over in a bipartisan fashion? Is that conceivable?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak about the whole history of the committee. I don't recall it in recent memory, but I appreciate the gentleman's sentiment.
Well, maybe, Mr. Chairman, you could take the lead, take the initiative.
Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, are there any amendments to H.R. 3864?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the opportunity to offer up an amendment. I would just say I remember hearings that we had as a member of Mr. Neal's select subcommittee on revenue, or special.
Does the gentleman is the gentleman presenting an amendment?
Yeah, excuse me, I have an amendment
okay.
at the
All right.
desk, yes.
Well, the clerk, if you could suspend while the clerk distributes the amendment. Then.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes.
The amendment is that's being distributed is the striking Section 5. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I will try and not take the full 5 minutes because you've been patient and some of my colleagues have yielded some time. But I did want to start by saying that this is, I think, a deep and serious issue for this committee. I appreciate Chairman Neal with the Select Revenue Committee having some hearings when he chaired. I understand we may even have in the Budget Committee, Chairman Ryan indicated in the spring we may be talking about some infrastructure budget issues. But we have before us today something that would break the 30-year agreement dealing with the Transit Trust Fund. It would, in fact, undercut the certainty of the trust fund. It would cut both transit and transportation enhancements, which are the most popular programs. Stuff them in the same box, maybe give them $40 billion, maybe not, but sever that relationship going forward. I think that's troubling because the cuts that this envisioned are not just the most popular in the states around the country that have the most demand. They are actually the most job intense. They generate more than 35,000 jobs for $1.25 billion per the study from the Bush administration in 2007. But it does destabilize these important long-term projects. It creates a temporary lull. If you deplete the transit trust fund, you prop up the highway portion a little bit. You don't have the certainty going forward of a bill that is right-sized. It creates what my friend Mr. Kine mentioned, a very unhealthy dynamic, sort of there'll be a continuing food fight. It is a step backwards from what we need, which is a broad bipartisan coalition to deal with the difficult challenges of a transportation trust fund that is in a downward spiral and will continue. It's going to get worse on an ongoing basis. I've been talking with my friend Mr. Gerlach, for instance, about a piece of legislation that would adjust the 12% truck excise tax and replace that with, at least temporarily, a fuel tax that would have some benefit. Maybe we could start talking about some of these elements in a constructive fashion. But this is accelerating the inevitable. It destabilizes transit. It is opposed across the board. And instead of capitalizing on a broad consensus that is business, labor, environment, you name it, what we do, if this passes and moves forward, which mercifully I don't think it will be enacted into law, but what you're doing is you're breaking up the agreement that could provide the support that Congress needs to get a spine, a backbone, take the heat, and deal with the long-term issues. So this is bad for transportation enhancements. It's destabilizing. It breaks the trust in the trust fund, and it's going to complicate our long-term task, which I truly think that most of us want to deal with going forward, because this is a problem that's going to get worse over time. I would respectfully request that my colleagues agree with me, support the amendment, strike the raid on the highway trust, the transit trust fund, and be able to deal with something that has a chance of passage and that will ultimately solve the problem. This provides neither stability or additional resources, and it's just going to create problems for us all. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rangels recognized as a co-author of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, just giving up jurisdiction over this piece of legislation where we've had substantial input strikes a blow against the historic nature of how we followed mass transit over the years. But more importantly, it would seem to me that an issue that hundreds of millions of people would be affected by, that it would be good for the Republican leadership as well as the Democrats to be able to fully explain to mass transit authorities and our mayors as to why you think this is in their best interests. This is especially so when those people who allegedly know more about transportation than this committee indicate that it's a bad transportation bill. And of course, we always refer to Secretary Ray LaHood, who probably has been one of the most bipartisan secretaries of transportation we've ever had. But having said that, when we're talking about jobs, and the Speaker has gone out of his way to indicate that this has nothing to do with jobs, and then, of course, the Budget Chairman, I just want the Budget Chairman to, I just like to get the Budget Chairman just for a minute. Paul, thank you. I'm so sorry to interrupt your discussion, but it just seems to me that we're adding $40 billion to the deficit at a time that we don't know where we're going to get it. I'm confident that there'll be some way that we can find numbers, but is it true that right now we have no clue as to how we're going to pay for the $40 billion that we're taking out of the excise tax and transferring it to a lump sum payment?
As you know, we're only marking up part of this bill, but I'm confident.
I'm sorry.
I'm confident the offsets will be there when we bring the bill to the floor.
But they're not there now.
We're only marking up part of this bill. Not in all of our jurisdiction.
Well, what makes you confident? Well, no. Listen, you're the Budget Chairman. I suspect you can get some numbers for us, but I really believe that the whole Congress ought to be involved as they explain to their constituents about what impact this will have on Amtrak and so many other things. I also believe that, Mr. Chairman, that this is a question of environment. We, for some reason, has been advocating leave your car at home, don't get a car, avoid congestion of traffic, use mass transit, and we have tried to believe that we were part of national leadership and getting people to use mass transit instead of this. Now, assuming that this is the best thing in the world, which hardly anyone from my city believes that it is, our communities have to be educated when you're making such a dramatic, historic change in the way we fund mass transit bills. And so we that come from a whole lot of communities now have to go back home and say that the Budget Chairman is confident that when the time comes, the $40 billion that are promised, but we have no clue as to where it comes from, will be there for us. I think it's bad legislation. I want to thank the gentleman from Oregon to constantly having the courage to bring up these embarrassing things, but it would be helpful, and I'm certainly glad that the chairman referred to my chairmanship, because one of the things I was most proud of is that whether the minority agreed or disagreed, all of the major decisions, we had hearings, we invited comment, and at least people would know exactly the direction we were taking and the remedies that we've had for the adverse effect the legislation would have on their constituents. And so whatever statements, I'd like to have a copy of your opening statement to see whether or not this way of funding mass transit, which is a national energy provision, not just the committee's jurisdiction, whether this is the best way to go. And for those who are confident that it is, I guess all I can say, Mr. Chairman, is give us a chance to see how you're going to pay for it and whether or not those people who have the responsibility of making investments now and into the future, whether they think this is the way to go. So let me thank you for the courtesy extended to me by the chair, and I just want to thank once again the gentleman from Oregon. I yield back my time.
Mr. Brady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I withdraw my point of order. And it's been, I think, stated here very well, and to clarify, this bill won't eliminate the account for mass transit. It simply provides a smarter and more equitable funding source for mass transit. In fact, it's a step forward. The way current policy works today, mass transit account would only receive about $25 billion over the next 5 years. With this change, the bill would provide the account with $40 billion and do that without increasing the deficit. Plus, the fact it's given up front provides more interest and a better stream of revenue than what we have today. And under the current policy, which, by the way, was created in 1983, a much different time, CBO projects mass transit account, as the chairman said, will run dry by fiscal year 2014. One of the things that's made the Highway Trust Fund unsustainable in the short term, by the way, has been the diversion of revenues to other things, including mass transit, which doesn't contribute anything to the trust fund. And while the bill being marked up in the Transportation Infrastructure Committee eliminates the diversion of trust fund revenue in many areas, our bill actually preserves the mass transit account, makes it sustainable for the next 5 years, not merely running dry in 2. So keeping the mass transit account solvent for an additional 3 years will allow us to engage, I think, in a serious, thoughtful conversation about how to equitably fund mass transit moving forward in an appropriate way. Final point, Mr. Chairman, this is a policy from 1983. Much has changed in transportation. Gasoline back then was 91 cents a gallon. Average new car was $7,000 to buy. I'm not sure one of our members, Aaron Schock, was even born back then. A lot has changed in our economy and in our infrastructure. We need to look for smarter, more innovative ways to fund these important programs like mass transit. For that purpose, I respectfully oppose the amendment.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott is recognized. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Levin is seeking time.
You want to go? You know, I kind of listen with some sadness because it's very difficult to have a thorough discussion from the beginning on these issues. And they come to us, and essentially the die is cast. We're kind of on automatic pilot. And I think that undermines the importance of this committee. Because the basic fact, in terms of the basic structure, what's happening is that we're allowing robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's essentially what's going on here. And what we're doing is overturning a structure that has existed for 30 years. And I think, Mr. Brady, times have changed, and they've only accentuated the importance of mass transit. And essentially what we're doing is saying that we want to rob the certainty, not immediately, but after 5 years, that there will be this money for mass transit. And why is that? It's in part because this committee has not faced up to the need to adequately fund transportation. And so you on the majority side don't want to do that. And so you're essentially taking money away and saying, okay, we'll get it someplace else. And Mr. Ryan, who has opposed the use of general fund monies in the past, will not tell us where in the world this money will come from. So not only in terms of the long-term structure are we robbing Peter to pay Paul, we may be in the budget robbing from other programs because of what we're doing here today. And that is, I don't understand it. When Mr. Brady, you say it's a diversion, mass transit, for the person who drives highways in metropolitan areas and beyond, providing mass transit isn't a diversion from their need. They take an hour and a half to get to work if they leave at 7 a.m. And if they go back home at 8 p.m. It's not a diversion. It's a structure to try to make sure there is an assured flow of money for mass transit. And maybe, as expressed sometimes in this place, you have an aversion to mass transit, but that's a mistake. But I close with this. Fortunately, in terms of this proposal on transportation, this is a dead end. This can't pass. It's irresponsible. It divides your ranks. It causes the Speaker to say, this isn't a jobs bill, because he wants to appeal to some within your ranks who don't want public monies spent assuredly for transportation. So he says this isn't a jobs bill? No, you're just twisting yourself by doing this. You're twisting your own ranks, you're twisting the Congress, and I think you're twisting the country. We need mass transit. You shouldn't take money away in the longer term. You should not overturn a structure that has existed for 30 years, underfunded. But don't use that as an excuse to destroy the structure. And that's what you're doing if you vote against this amendment.
Mr. McDermott's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following on the tone of Mr. Levin, I think that what is sad about this debate here is that we are making one of the most significant changes we have made in a very, very long time without hearings, without any open discussion about any of this. You have never, no one sitting on this committee has ever seen a bill where everybody from the Club for Growth all the way to the labor unions and environmentalists is opposed to it. That's a significant statement that you're pushing this issue through against all the interests that are affected by this. And without debate and without any real discussion. Now, I got to the legislature in 1970, and the first bill I put in was to take away the constitutional provision in the state of Washington that all gas tax had to go to highways, trying to bring in transit. This issue has been in every legislature, in every local government for the last 40 years. And Ronald Reagan came up with a way in the Highway Trust Fund, and then we took this money and we've guaranteed it to mass transit, but there are clearly people who don't want to adequately fund the highway fund. And so they're making this light bulb snatch of taking the transit money and putting it and starting to play games and putting at risk the mass transit in this country. Every single one of you is going to be affected. And you say, well, I won't be here in 5 years. That's the problem with the thinking on here. People are not thinking long term about what has to happen in this country. And so we make a change like this, make bonding unsure, make planning obsolete, because how can you plan if you can't look at the numbers and see where the money is and generally sort of figure out how we're going to put both at the federal level and the state level and the local level? You can't plan when you do not have a dedicated funding stream. That's what the gas tax in the state of Washington was all about, and they didn't want to take any of it and dedicate it to transit. Well, that's exactly what you're doing here. You're saying you don't want to dedicate anything to transit long term. I mean, how long do you buy a bus for? For 1 week or 1 year or 2 years? Buses are used for 3, 4, 5 years. I listen to people say, well, we've been kicking it down the road here, 5 months and 2 days and so forth. That is a direct result of the filibuster use in the United States Senate to prevent any kind of legislation getting through the Congress that would make the president look good.
So we got to find that out.
And the reason we have had all these gerrymandered and jury-rigged budgets over the last 2 years have been directly as a result of the leadership on the Republican side in the Senate that said our sole goal is to prevent the president from being reelected. Now, that leads to this kind of legislation, because everybody knows you got to do something about the highway fund, and we all know that, but nobody wants to have an honest discussion about it. And it is a sad day for this country when you run against all the interests in the whole country, everybody who's watching this on television, all the lobbyists for all the organizations that are watching this are recognizing that you are saying no. That's why the Club for Growth is going to score it. I'm going to wind up with a positive vote with the Club for Growth. That'll be the first in a long time for me, because this is something that is much bigger. It's not Republican and Democrat. It is philosophy about government, whether government should be involved. There's some people who still don't think we should have mass transit. They're still arguing about that question. And they just want all the money to go to the highway fund. My view is that this is a good amendment to force us back and start rethinking in a sensible way the policy for transportation in this country.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I believe Mr. Pascrell has been seeking recognition for some time, but all right. Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Chairman, I want to speak in favor of this amendment. Mass transit in many of our communities, many of our large cities, like the city of Atlanta, that is growing so fast, that more than 5 million people live in urban Atlanta. It is the lifeblood. I agree with Mr. McDermott. We need to take the long, hard look. This is about jobs, economic development, about growth, about the environment, about health. How do we want to leave this little piece of real estate that we call America? What do we want America to look like? Our cities, our neighborhoods, in the next 25, 30, 40, or 50 years. And that's why I support this amendment. And with that, I yield back my time.
Mr. Pascrell is recognized. We do have votes coming up, so if members could keep their comments
Mr.
brief.
Chairman.
We spent a lot of time on this issue. Mr. Pascrell.
I want to thank the chairman and Mr. Davis for your commitment to the water infrastructure private equity bonds. I think this is very, very important, very significant in terms of jobs. Mr. Chairman, this is serious business. We want to create jobs. We've talked at a lot of things when we've had discussions in Ways and Means about clarifying so that business people remove the anxiety about what's going to be the story next year and the year after. Now, you know, I really have to take exception to this part. When I came to the Congress, I learned about agriculture, and that in North Jersey we don't have too many farms, but that doesn't mean that it is not significant to the nation. And when we come to this hall, I think what we're trying to do is get across our artificial boundaries and create an America that we are all continue to be proud of. My state of New Jersey, which is the most densely populated state in America, has 1,100 people per square mile, and it's difficult to comprehend that when you're in the middle of Texas or you're in the middle of Montana. I understand that. I understand it. Just increasing highway capacity cannot be the only answer for the Garden State, because losing time in traffic is literally losing money. Today, every motorist is essentially assessed $710 backdoor tax because of all-around infrastructure decay. 867,000 people of my fellow New Jerseyans choose to use New Jersey Transit, the nation's largest statewide public transit system, which covers 5,300 miles. It helps to bring around 4.5 million commuters through the metropolitan area each workday. Of the transit's $1.16 billion fiscal year 2012 budget, $396 million of that $1.16 billion budget comes from dedicated federal transit funds. If we don't have those funds dedicated, we are not going to be able to continue to get cars off the road and get people into a much more comfortable setting where we don't delay productivity in the United States. And I'm asking you, I am begging you that we move in a different direction on this particular issue, and I support the amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Crowley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief as brief as I possibly can be. I know time is of the essence. I'm speaking in favor of the Blumenauer amendment, and I find it quite remarkable that we're here today when it was just announced again that jobs are in the increase, that the jobless rate has declined once again. And once again, it's good news for the American people, and somehow it's perceived, I think, unfortunately, as bad news for you all, and I think that's terrible. I think that's terrible that as our country is progressing and doing better, that somehow politically it's not seen as a good thing for you all. I think that's wrong. After all, you're on the majority here. Take some credit for some of the good things that are happening. Don't add another problem now to the difficulties of our country. And that's exactly what you're doing by cutting these funds, by delinking this account. And I'm not just speaking on behalf of my constituents in Queens and the Bronx, hundreds of thousands of whom rely upon mass transit for the only way to getting to and from work. They don't have cars. And quite frankly, we don't want them to have cars. They can't, at least for the purposes of going to and from work. The New York City MTA, the MTA in New York State, moves 8.5 million people every day. That's more people than the entire population of the state of Virginia, every day. It is more population than New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Montana, Delaware, South Dakota, Alaska, North Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming combined every day by mass transit. And that's just one day, every day, 365 days a year. 89% of all the trips into Manhattan during the morning rush hour between 8 and 9 a.m. are made by mass transit. 90% of people getting to and from work. That's over 500,000 trips in a peak hour. It's amazing that that takes place, and it is done in such an efficient way. For people that make that trip every day for work, there's no alternative for them to get to and from work. So this base bill is bad for them, and it's not just bad for my constituents. This bill looks like an effort to grind the New York mass transit system to a halt. Back in 1974, it was reported that then-President Gerald Ford told New York City to drop dead. I think this is the new version of telling not only New York City, but Boston, Chicago, L.A., and other major cities in the state to drop dead as well. I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, if I can, yesterday's CQ, dated February 2nd, the front page story about Speaker Boehner downplay stimulus of the highway bill, if there's no objection. And I'd also like to
Without objection.
I'd also like to add into the record a letter from the Metropolitan Transit Authority from the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Joseph Loda, who is strongly in opposition to this bill, as is, Mr. Chairman, the National Association of Realtors, as is the Chamber of Commerce, because it will hurt small business. And this will be a direct tax on middle-class families. Once again, you're saying to the middle class, we don't care how you get to work. We don't care how you are productive in this country. We're not going to support that. Somehow they're going to have to find this money. It's going to be more tolls in terms of the cost of tolls. It will lead to an increase in the cost of a fare to and from major metropolitan areas. I think it's wrong. I think it's terrible that we're having this discussion today, especially on the heels of good news for Americans, that this economy is improving, that people are getting back to work, less people on the unemployment rolls, that housing seems to be moving in the right direction, and yet we're going to find another way in which we can we can mess this up. So, Mr. Chairman, on that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
I have no further requests for recognition, so the question, I'm prepared to move the amendment, unless, all right. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon and New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The clerk will, a roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? No. Mr. Herger, no. Mr. Johnson?
No.
Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, no. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Gerlach?
No.
Mr. Gerlach, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, no. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, no. Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Levin?
Yes.
Mr. Levin, yes. Mr. Rangel?
Aye.
Mr. Rangel, aye. Mr. Stark?
Aye.
Mr. Stark, aye. Mr. McDermott?
Aye.
Mr. McDermott, aye. Mr. Lewis? Aye. Mr. Lewis, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Becerra? Aye. Mr. Becerra, aye. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Aye. Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Aye. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Aye. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Aye. Mr. Pascrell, aye. Ms. Berkeley? Aye. Ms. Berkeley, aye. Mr. Crowley?
Aye for the middle class.
Mr. Crowley, aye. Mr. Ryan? No. Mr. Ryan, no. Chairman Camp?
No.
Chairman Camp, no.
The clerk will report the vote.
15 yeas, 22 nays.
There being 15 ayes and 22 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to H.R. 3864? Mr. McDermott is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think they will distribute the amendment. I think I can talk about it while they're distributing it. We had a oversight hearing in the committee held by Mr. Teaberry and Mr. Bustani about the harbor maintenance tax. This bill contains a rather tepid sense of the Congress that we'd like you to do a little bit more if you can. I think that that's not strong enough. I really think that what came out of the hearing was the fact that there's $6.1 billion sitting in the trust fund in the harbor maintenance tax. Now, you may say, why are you talking about harbors? Well, transportation is not all on land and on roads. For some of you who live in the middle of the country, there are coasts, there are harbors, there are rivers, and transportation in those is as important, or maybe more important in some ways, to the entire country than some of the things we've talked about already. The need for having a highway system on the road, on the water, because we call it the water highway in Seattle, because we move so much traffic in and out on ferry systems and on traffic coming from cargo ships, that it is imperative that we have harbors that are functioning. And 35% of the dredging that should be done in this country is being done today, while $6 billion sits in a fund because it isn't appropriated. And what this amendment does is require that that money be appropriated and spent in the cities and towns. It also has a provision at the end for a somewhat broadening of the use of the Harbor Maintenance Fund, because right now it's only used for dredging. And I don't mind that 20% of the money from the entire country goes to Louisiana and dredges the Mississippi, because that affects everybody all the way to Minneapolis and Omaha and everywhere else. So it's very important that the mouth of the Mississippi be cleared. But in Seattle, we have a problem with the seawall. We have a wall that was put in 100 years ago that is failing. We know we're going to have an earthquake. We know that someday it will happen, and we're going to lose that seawall, and we're going to have a terrible mess in the harbor in Seattle. We need to replace the seawall. Now, for a number of sessions, I've been putting small appropriations into the bills to have the Corps of Engineers study the seawall. And they were in my office about 5 days ago, and they told me, well, we're about halfway through. We don't have any more money. And the study and the preparation and the beginning of the replacement of the seawall in Seattle is as important to this country as is the dredging of the mouth of the Mississippi. So I really think that it is a good amendment for the bill, and I think that anybody who thinks you can move all the agricultural goods out of this country without paying attention to the harbors and the rivers simply doesn't understand how this country works. My state, people think of Boeing and Microsoft and all that sort of stuff. We are an agricultural export state. Wheat, all the wheat from all the way from North Dakota and Montana comes through Seattle and goes to the Far East. And that's how it operates. We all work together. And I really think that the reason I put this up here is I didn't think that, I thought it would be good for an amendment to come from this side, showing that there's bipartisan support. I'm sure Mr. Bustani will want to say something about this, because it's important to him, too, that all the rivers and all the harbors be dredged. I yield back the balance of my time.
Dr. Bustani is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Washington State for raising this really very important and vital issue facing our country. We covered this, I thought, very thoroughly in the subcommittee hearings, the joint subcommittee hearing, and I would just simply say to the gentleman, as we move this thing forward, this legislation forward, I'll be happy to work with him. It is of prime interest to me. And, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for just a question? Are you asking me to withdraw and that we'll work in conference committee or in the bill on the floor or in the Rules Committee?
I would just simply say that I'll be happy to work with you throughout this legislative process to get this done. We have been very much engaged in this, and I welcome the additional support in trying to get this done.
All right, Mr. Neal's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen,
briefly.
Yielding back.
Yes.
Okay, Mr.
Thank you,
Neal's
Mr. Chairman.
recognized.
Briefly, this is a good amendment, and Mr. Bustani, Mr. T-Berry, and Mr. Lewis and I held a hearing on it the other day. It was very informative, and the national principle is at stake here, because not only is this good for the West Coast with the expansion of the Panama Canal, for those of us who supported the FTA, what's going to happen on the eastern ports across the country as soon as that expansion takes place and is completed is going to be astounding. And I think that the danger here is where this money could be applied for specific purposes. It's now being used for general purposes, but it's moving away from the manner in which it was intended. So I think this is a really good amendment, and we should try very hard to exercise our prerogative to make sure that this is a notion of categorical assistance as opposed to general purpose.
All right. Any further
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. McDermott.
With the understanding with Mr. Bustani and other members, I think that there is an opportunity for us to work this issue before the transportation bill passes, and I would withdraw my amendment, and we'll work together on it.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there additional amendments to H.R. 3864? Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment, and just before I offer the amendment formally, Mr. Pascrell and Mr. Reed.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to reserve a point of order.
If the gentleman would suspend for a minute while the amendment's being...
I thought Texas might have an interest in this issue. My point is that there's not a more bipartisan organization in America than the United States Conference of Mayors. Having that DNA in my career, it's important to acknowledge that we don't wake up in those city halls every day driven by what the Heritage Foundations or Brookings or some group says. You generally get up every day figuring out how you're going to make it work for that day. And part of the role that lends itself to some of that excitement is how you might increase and enhance productivity and efficiency. That largely comes from the idea that the ease with which we get from one point to another enhances, as I've just described, those opportunities. And the U.S. Conference of Mayors is opposed to this legislation as it's proposed. So I have a series of amendments here. I'm going to get through one amendment, but it's going to be important because of this. Every member of this committee has been to a groundbreaking, a press conference, or a ribbon cutting based upon the proposals that I'm going to outline. And I've worked hard on these over a long period of time, and they've all been remarkably successful, and some of them have actually been bipartisan. So let me start with the Build America bonds. Enacted as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, BABs are taxable bonds for which the U.S. Treasury Department pays a 35% direct subsidy to the issuer to offset borrowing costs. Build America bonds had a very strong reception from both issuers and investors. Every airport expansion across America for a medium-sized community or large community has used Build America bonds during the last few years. It has supported more than $181 billion of financing for new public capital infrastructure projects such as schools, bridges, and hospitals. My amendment would extend this program with few modifications through 2013. They've been a huge success in my home state of Massachusetts. The University of Massachusetts has benefited in particular. We've been able to expand innovations and renovations of a number of public schools, a memorial school in Grafton, Minnechaug Regional High School in Hamden-Wilbraham, a new vocational high school, an elementary school are just 4 examples. In addition, they were used in Massachusetts to improve roads and bridges. $3 billion accelerated bridge program was authorized to repair and rebuild hundreds of structurally deficient bridges across the Commonwealth. The inaugural financings of these accelerated bridge program investments were sold as Build America bonds, reducing the state's borrowing costs by tens of millions of dollars over the life of the bonds. 12,000 construction jobs were the result. These bridges include the South End Bridge in Springfield and the Broadbrook Bridge in East Hampton, where construction is almost substantially completed. Next, as noted by Mr. Davis and by Mr. Reed, exemption of private activity bonds. I worked hard on this, it seems like a career ago, with Mr. Houghton. My amendment exempts tax-exempt private activity bonds from AMT for 2012. Who can be against it? A similar provision to this was included in 2010. This provision was extremely successful and should be extended. New markets tax credits. The amendment would also allow new markets tax credits to be used to offset AMT liability in 2012. I am very proud of what we've done with new markets tax credits. Again, every member of this committee has participated in a groundbreaking, ribbon-cutting, or press conference based upon an initiative that was financed in part by new markets. I have a number in my testimony that I will offer to you later on, Mr. Chairman. Lastly, bank-qualified bonds. Another component of my amendment relates to bank-qualified bonds. These bonds were created in 1986 to encourage banks to invest in tax-exempt bonds and to provide municipalities access to lower-cost borrowing that they would need in order to provide services and invest in schools, roads, bridges, and other projects. Recently, Chicopee, Massachusetts, utilized them for infrastructure work in water and sewer.
We're going to try to finish.
Congress has expanded the use of bank-qualified bonds in 2009 and by raising the issuer limit to $30 million annually. Offset. I want to highlight the fact that this amendment is fully offset by denying Section 199 deduction for certain major integrated oil companies, with the largest oil companies reporting quarter after quarter after quarter of huge profitability. I have to question whether or not we should be using those profits for the purpose of long-term infrastructure investment. I think this is a fair offset. This amendment is not partisan. You've all voted for it in one way or another over the course of your time on this committee. Most importantly, there's an element in politics that is at every groundbreaking and at every ribbon cutting and against every investment or expenditure. And I hope today that we can clarify who's where when you have an opportunity to vote on this amendment, and I yield back my time.
All right. Mr. Brady's recognized.
I withdraw my point of order.
I would urge a no vote on this amendment on the floor. This would be a cut-go violation and could jeopardize the entire underlying bill. Are there any additional
Mr. Chairman,
speakers?
could you
If
clarify
not,
your position on this? It would jeopardize?
it could jeopardize the bill on the floor because there will be a cut-go
Mr. Chairman,
violation.
Mr. Chairman, let me say something. The one part of our careers,
recognized for closing on his amendment.
the one part of our careers that has been marked by infrastructure is members of the Congress have regularly rolled leadership on both sides because of infrastructure needs. I was happy to participate with Mr. Schuster in rolling a former Speaker of the House and happy to participate with Mr. Rowe in rolling a former Speaker of the House on our side. Members of the Congress united about this purpose. And I want to say, because Mr. Berg raised an issue earlier, 19,000 people moved last year to North Dakota. With low-cost energy, in addition to a state that's growing, a 3% unemployment rate, which is extraordinary, you are going to need a dedicated stream of revenue, and don't let anybody fool you in years to come. This is very important, and I hope that Mr. Camp's position here is noted, because what Mr. Camp essentially said is that this amendment is so good that it could bring about the defeat of this proposal on the House floor.
I would just say not based on the substance of the amendment, but I see as no further members seek recognition. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Neal. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. I see that a roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? No. Mr. Herger, no. Mr. Johnson?
No.
Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Brady? No. Mr. Brady, no. Mr. Ryan?
No.
Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, no. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, no. Mr. Davis?
Keep going.
Mr. Davis, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Gerlach? No. Mr. Gerlach, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, no. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, no. Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Levin?
Aye.
Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rangel?
Aye.
Mr. Rangel, aye. Mr. Stark? Aye. Mr. Stark, aye. Mr. McDermott?
Aye.
Mr. McDermott, aye. Mr. Lewis? Aye. Mr. Lewis, aye. Mr. Neal? Aye. Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, aye. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Yes. Mr. Pascrell, yes. Ms. Berkeley? Ms. Berkeley, yes. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, aye. Chairman Camp?
No.
Chairman Camp, no.
The clerk will report the vote.
15 ayes, 22 noes.
There being 15 ayes and 22 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to H.R. 3864? If there are no further amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 3864 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. No. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? Aye. Mr. Herger, aye. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Davis? Aye. Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Reichert? Aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? No. Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, yes. Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, yes. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, yes. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, yes. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel?
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. Stark?
How much time is it?
Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Ms. Berkeley? Ms. Berkeley, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
Oh, that was...
The clerk will report the vote.
20 ayes, 17 noes.
There being 20 ayes and 17 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 3864 is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned. Oh, yeah. Too late.